Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're putting a spotlight on one of the defining figures of the 20th century, Benito Mussolini. We're going to stick strictly to the historical record to unpack the life, the incredibly rapid rise, and the ultimate fall of the man who literally founded fascism. It's actually a pretty wild historical irony that the guy who ended up building Europe's first fascist dictatorship was originally named Benito by his fiercely socialist father, specifically in honor of the Mexican socialist reformist Benito Juarez. Right? Okay, let's dive into this.
So how does an everyday schoolteacher become a totalitarian dictator? It's a genuine historical paradox. Think about it. When we picture the dictators who drove those devastating global conflicts of the 1900s, we usually imagine lifelong military generals or, political titans who were just born into power. But Mussolini's origins? Surprisingly ordinary. So today, we're tracing that exact path to see how extreme ideological shifts and a really systematic dismantling of democratic institutions made this unprecedented leap actually happen.
To map this all out, we've got four main areas to cover today. First up, who exactly was Mussolini? Second, we'll track his path to power. Third, we'll look at the creation of that totalitarian state. And finally, we'll cover the war, his fall, and the very end.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1. Who is Benito Mussolini?
Born back in 1883, Mussolini actually started out his professional life as a school teacher and a socialist journalist. And he wasn't just a casual participant on the sidelines either. He was deeply involved, eventually becoming a prominent editor for a really influential socialist newspaper called Avanti. But then, a massive ideological shift hit during the First World War. He entirely abandoned those early socialist views and took a sharp, hard pivot toward extreme nationalism. And this brilliantly illustrates how the absolute chaos of global conflict can completely rewire a political trajectory, pulling someone from one end of the political spectrum all the way over to the extreme opposite.
That massive pivot toward extreme nationalism eventually crystallized into a brand new identity for him, Il Duce. It literally means the leader, and it's the title he used from 1925 all the way to 1943 to build up this massive cult of personality. It was all about projecting himself to the Italian public as the singular, unquestionable authority figure who was single-handedly driving the entire nation forward.
Moving right along to Section 2, the path to power.
Guys, the speed of his escalation here is honestly staggering. He was born in 1883, sure, but he didn't even form the fascist movement until 1919. And yet, by October of 1922, literally just 3 years later, he's already orchestrating the infamous March on Rome. This wasn't some slow, gradual, generational shift in influence. No, this was a rapid, hyper-aggressive mobilization that caught the entire democratic establishment completely off guard and essentially forced their hand.
Now, you might be wondering how he moved so fast. Well, a key tool in that rapid rise was the Black Shirts, or Svartskjortor. They were essentially a private paramilitary force loyal to Mussolini and Mussolini alone. They absolutely were not an official branch of the state military. Think of them more as the physical muscle behind his political ambitions. They supplied the sheer intimidation needed to challenge the government, and they were notorious for using absolutely brutal tactics, like famously forcing castor oil down the throats of their political opponents just to humiliate and silence them. Which brings us to Section 3, the totalitarian dictatorship. Let's move to and see how this builds, because once that threat of a coup was firmly established by the March on Rome in 1922, the dominoes just fell incredibly fast. Terrified of a full-blown civil war, King Victor Emmanuel III formally appointed Mussolini as prime minister. So get this, he actually enters the highest levels of government through a perfectly legal appointment, albeit one that was heavily coerced by the threat of mass violence. But the second he was inside the system, Mussolini immediately banned all opposition parties, completely clearing the board. By 1927, Italy had been entirely transformed from a functioning democracy into a totalitarian police state. The entire system was just dismantled from the inside out. And that leads us straight into our final chapter, Section 4, War, Fall, and the End.
So the really crucial takeaway here is how his foreign policy completely doomed his domestic control. Mussolini formed this incredibly tight political and military alliance with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, which ultimately pulled Italy formally into the Second World War in 1940. But here's the catch. Italy's actual military reality on the ground, it did not even come close to matching the invincible, unstoppable image Mussolini had been projecting for years. The military campaigns in Greece and North Africa were, undeniably, massive failures. And these disastrous defeats absolutely shattered the country's infrastructure and critically weakened that iron grip Mussolini previously had on power back home.
Those final years were just a rapid, incredibly frantic collapse. By July of 1943, right after the highly successful Allied invasion of Sicily, things at home were so incredibly dire that Mussolini was actually deposed and imprisoned by his own fascist council and the king. Now, he was rescued by elite German soldiers late that same year, but his freedom really didn't last long at all. In April of 1945, while he was desperately trying to flee across the border into Switzerland, he was captured by Italian partisans and executed.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the ultimate irony of his so-called power after that rescue in 1943. Sure, Hitler installed him as the head of the Salo Republic, but this was entirely a German puppet state set up in northern Italy. So Il Duce literally went from being this absolute, unquestionable dictator to a mere figurehead who was serving entirely at the behest of the German military, long before his actual execution.
Which brings us to a final, pretty heavy historical question to leave you with. Just how quickly can a democratic nation transform into a totalitarian state when extremists are given even an inch of power? As the historical record clearly shows us today, it takes merely a matter of years. All it takes is a mobilized paramilitary, a fractured political landscape, and a system that's ultimately willing to yield to the threat of force. It's a very real blueprint from the past that definitely continues to challenge how we understand modern political fragility today.